Welcome to My Tiny Bottles, the series where I explore my grandmother's legacy of miniature liquor bottles, one tiny bottle at a time. I'm your host, Tammy Coxon. On my reveal video, I talked about Maker's Mark coming out in the 80s. And yes, bourbon fans, you're right, that's not technically true. But that is when it blew up and became the national brand that would help make bourbon America's favorite whiskey again. The thing that tipped the scales was a 1980 article on the front page of the Wall Street Journal titled, "Maker's Mark Goes Against the Grain to Make Its Mark." After that, their phone never stopped ringing. But before that, the company had spent much of the last 25 years trying to get anyone outside of Kentucky to even notice them. It wasn't necessarily their fault. The post-World War II period was not kind to American whiskey. They'd barely begun to recover from Prohibition when the distilleries were shut down to make torpedo fuel. They start building bourbon supplies back up, but quality is poor and Scotch imports soared. In the 1950s, the whiskey is finally starting to get good again. Some say great, but a guy named Louis Rosenstiel of Schenley Distilleries massively overproduced ahead of the Korean War. When shutdowns didn't materialize, his whiskey glutted the market, lowering prices and driving small distillers out of business. Bourbon was cheap, getting cheaper, and still no one was buying it. Into this mess walks Bill Samuels, a man on a mission he'd been thinking about since just after Prohibition, creating a new, better bourbon whiskey that would appeal to modern palates. The story is pretty well known. Bill recruited industry friends to help him develop his new recipe. His wife Margie baked 150 loaves of bread to test the various potential mash bills, because that was faster than waiting for bourbon. Based on this, he decided to use Red River wheat instead of rye as his secondary grain. He made other changes too, all with an eye towards creating a better tasting whiskey. Land was purchased, whiskey was made, and once it was in barrels in 1954, Bill famously gathered his whole family together and burned his father's recipe. While the whiskey was aging, Bill's wife Marge Samuel set about creating the brand identity that we all know today. You'd think that Maker's distinctive look would have been great for marketing, but the brand was saddled with the bad reputation the bourbon industry had given itself and struggled to find a market outside of Kentucky. One of the main ways they turned things around was by being the first company to do something that's really common today: charge a lot of money for something so that people will pay a lot of money for it. They were determined to change bourbon's cheap reputation. So the tagline of their 1965 advertising campaign was, "It tastes expensive and is." Air travel was booming in the 1970s, and many bottles of Makers, probably looking just like mine, made their way onto the plane. And then in 1980 came that Wall Street Journal article, and the bourbon world would never be the same again. If you enjoyed this video, please like or comment below. Want to see more? Be sure to subscribe. You can also check out mytinybottles.com for a deeper dive into each bottle, including blogs and podcasts. And finally, follow My Tiny Bottles on all your socials. Cheers!